This is our panel, The Next 100 Years Begins Now. My name's Jeff Kightlinger. I am the retired general manager of the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. And emphasis on retired, because that means that I don't have to feel like I need to wear a tie here. We have the 7 basin states here, and Peter didn't bother either. The 7 basin states representatives here. I'm going to introduce them in no particular order, just wave your hand when I come to you. Tom Buschatzke from the great state of Arizona, Director of Arizona DWR. John Entsminger from our host state of Nevada, General Manager, Southern Nevada Water Authority. Brandon Gebhart of the scenic state of Wyoming, our state engineer. Estevan Lopez, the beautiful state of New Mexico, Commissioner for New Mexico Upper Colorado River Commission. Becky Mitchell from the wonderful state of Colorado, Director of Colorado Water Conservation Board. Peter Nelson of the unique state of California, Chair of the Colorado River Board. And Gene Shawcroft from the outstanding state of Utah, Colorado River Authority of Utah. They all have incredibly long biographies. They've got a zillion accomplishments. They've gone to really nice schools, and they've got a lot of degrees to prove it. So if you want more info on them, that's my introduction, and you can read it in the package there. I'm going to just do a quick backdrop of the state of the situation, and then just ask questions and ask them to jump in. And they're kind of aiming at upper basin, lower basin. So setting the stage for this, title this is The Next 100 Years Begins Now. Did not come up with a title. I thought it was a really good title. I like the idea that it looks backwards and looks forwards at the same time, looking at a little bit of the history and the challenges we have. If you look backwards, I would say what the Compact founders, the writers of the Compact, by and large, it probably achieved what they were trying to do. What they really were focused on was economic growth and prosperity for the 7 states for the next 100 years. And it achieved that goal. But it's also important to look at what they didn't try to solve and what they didn't try to address. If you look in the Compact itself, they knew Mexico was an issue, and they didn't try to address it, but they did plug in a placeholder that said, if and when the United States got to Mexico, we're going to share that burden 50-50, upper basin, lower basin. When it came to the tribes, they didn't even put in a placeholder, but they did acknowledge the tribes. That will have to be addressed by the United States sometime down the road, and no further comment. And when it came to the environment, it didn't even cross their mind. So you had some very huge issues left, not addressed by the Compact. But it did achieve their principal goal, economic growth and prosperity for the 7 states for the next 100 years. So moving forward, looking forward to the next 100 years, these 7 folks have the incredibly difficult, semi-impossible task of setting the stage for the next 100 years. We knew things were, just to give a little bit of backdrop and how we got to here recently, we knew starting in 2000 that a day of reckoning was coming. That's when the drought began, and we began working in earnest to try and get ahead of the curve. In 2003, we did the quantification settlement agreement in California. That was an incredibly hard and brutal negotiation. It took 10 years to get for that to reach completion. We actually came up with a draft QSA in 1998, took it back to the various boards of Colorado and California, and it collapsed. Everybody denounced it and said, this is a terrible deal. And it took 5 more years of negotiating to get there. It took annual threats on Federal Friday from Bruce Babbitt and then Gail Norton. It took Bennett, the hammer Rayleigh, hammering on us to get to closure. And certainly from Metropolitan, I remember those days, and I know IID does too. But eventually, that got done. And California cut 800,000 acre feet from using 5.2 to 4.4. Pretty huge deal. And then just 4 years later, we kind of realized as the drought continued, we have to now deal with beyond California. And we did the first ever shortage sharing guidelines in 2007. And Arizona took a huge amount of cuts in that deal. the lion's share of those cuts, and Nevada also took cuts as well. California said, we gave it the office with the QSA, and we didn't contribute anything more. And we really thought, maybe we've gotten ahead of the curve. Starting around 2013, we realized, no, we're not ahead of the curve. We have to do another round of reductions. And for the next 6 years, we hammered and negotiated really tough set of cuts, eventually resulting in the DCP, the Drought Contingency Plan, in 2019. And that took a lot of leverage and pressure. Commissioner of Reclamation, Brenda Buzzsaw Berman, hammering us or cutting us. And we did it. We came up with it, and it was done after 6 years. So these have been incredibly hard. Now, recently, Commissioner Camille Touton, I'm not going to assign a tool for her, basically said, to stabilize the system, we need to come up with 2 to 4 million acre feet. And the math works, but if you look at what we negotiated over 20 years, we didn't get to 2 to 4 million acre feet. So this basically says 20 years of really hard work and innovative deals, you now have to double it, probably triple it, and instead of years, decades, we got to do this in months. This is the incredibly difficult task that these folks are going to have to deal with. You got the goal, balance the river, so come up with 2 to 4 million acre feet in reductions just to get to balance. You also need to accommodate continued growth, and you have to deal with partially and addressed and some not even addressed at all issues of Mexico, the tribes, and the environment, all with the same pool. So that's kind of the stark and grim state of affairs, and so now we get to do the questions, and they get to figure out how we're going to do that. So we'll start with the lower basin. You got a river that's producing 12 to 13 million acre feet a year, give or take, inflow of late. You got the lower basin using 7.5 million acre feet. You have, depending on your math, 1.2, 1.5 million acre feet of losses annually. So that's about 9 million acre feet. Lower basin, you're 3/4 of the usage. You haven't gotten to Mexico, and then you've got what are you going to have left over in the upper basin. So the math kind of says the bulk of these cuts, maybe 3/4, maybe more, kind of has to come from the lower basin. So let's start with our larger user, California. What do you think? How do you see this developing?
Jeff, I didn't realize how hot this seat was going to be, but
that's why you didn't wear a tie.
yeah, there. Obviously, the compact and the 07 guidelines, the DCP were good instruments to use at the time. They're good instruments to use into the future as well. Well written, but there was not a consideration of what you've just described in terms of the dry hydrology that we're facing today. With the reservoirs that are this low and the runoffs that are so dismal, I think Deputy Director Palumbo described it well in terms of the lack of efficiency in the runoff is a real thing with sublimation and climate change. There's a real need to balance the Glen Canyon Dam releases, including the gains and losses between Glen Canyon Dam and the international border. And that we have a priority system that addresses evaporation in the lower basin in terms of a diminution of supply, but it's a real need for us to balance this Glen Canyon Dam release between the states of Nevada, Arizona, and California. It also requires, I believe, a commitment for the upper basin to take the actions that they need to do in order for the senior priority users to feel to have the, I wouldn't say equity, I'd say the management of the priority system. And so it's There's two basins, but management as a whole in terms of addressing this particular issue. So I think to the answer to your question, we need to balance these Glen Canyon Dam releases between Glen Canyon Dam and the Mexican border.
Our second largest user in the lower basin, Tom, how about Arizona's take?
So, Jeff, I think the single biggest issue that is a roadblock to solving the problem and stabilizing the river is the priority system. And I include in the priority system the curtailment call potential for the upper basin, and certainly between the states in the lower basin, but also within my state, the priority system for higher and lower priorities. And I fully understand that is the way things have evolved, but it's really hard to come up with solutions that will not be implemented across everyone if we strictly follow the priority system. The lower priority water users, which are the cities, we could wipe out every drop of their water. We're not going to still stabilize the system. And hopefully everyone knows that the 2 to 4 million acre feet that was asked for by the commissioner is on top of the DCP plus the 07 guidelines, which is 1.375 million acre feet at the max. So it's not 2 to 4 million, it's 2 to 4 million plus 1.375. Doesn't leave a lot of water to divvy up. So I heard many times, and Chuck Cullum earlier talk about the climate change impacts being felt in the upper basin, but I also believe that that's being felt in Arizona under the priority system. Hindsight, who knows what would have happened in 1968 when the priority was put into the Basin Project Act, but it seems like at the time there weren't these climate change projections reducing the flow of the river to the numbers Jeff said, 12 to 13. Maybe it's 11, maybe it's 9. We don't know yet. So we are feeling that the impacts of climate change in the lower basin, and we are feeling the impacts of climate change, in my opinion, in Arizona under this issue of the junior priority. So one thing I want people to know, if you go back and read the act, the 68 Act about the priority, it basically says when there is not 7.5 million acre feet available to the Secretary for delivery to the 3 lower basin states, that's when Arizona's junior priority kicks in. Even though the system is not healthy, there's way more than 7.5 million acre feet in the system right now. So I would question whether or not the priority system really has kicked in. Nevertheless, Arizona agreed to take the bulk of the shortages under the DCP and under the guidelines because it doesn't want to get to a litigation fight over what that language means, and it wants to protect the system, and by protecting the system, we're protecting ourselves. So I think I'll stop there, Jeff.
Okay. John?
So I'll answer the question directly. The answer is yes. The lower basin is going to have to take the lion's share of the reductions. I'm a big believer in the law. I'm a big believer in food security, but I'm an even bigger believer in math. And the math says that if you're going to cut 4 million acre feet, which might be a low number. Our modeling shows that the cuts to the lower basin might be 6 million acre feet in 2025. So, don't get any false sense of security that 2 to 4 million is the final answer here. When you're cutting, 4 million acre feet out of, 12, and 3/4 of the use are, downstream of Hoover Dam, that's where the cuts are going to come. And if the literal enforcement of the law of man is 27 million Americans don't have water, then those laws will not be enforced.
Turning to Upper Basin, In 2019, as part of the drought contingency plan, the Upper Basin pledged to investigate the feasibility of an Upper Basin demand management program. In 2022, 3 years later, on the 5-point plan, the Upper Basin committed to consider an Upper Basin demand management plan. So for the past 3 years, effectively, the Upper Basin's been planning to make a plan. And I'd like to put you guys on the spot and go, when do we get a plan? And when does it have some things like numbers in it? How about Becky? Just you first.
All
Everybody
right.
gets a turn.
I love the numbers question. When are we going to get numbers? Partly because I'm also a believer in math, and I think the math is the most important thing here. So I want to talk about numbers for just a second, and then we can talk a little bit about demand management. But I find it somewhat troubling with the continued question for specific numbers. It seems like there is not an understanding of how the Upper Basin works and manages. We live within the means of the river every day. So what is provided is what is available. And so it is hard to predict what we can do next year because the predictions have consistently failed. We've planned on a river that is not there. And so for us to make a commitment on something that is not a sure thing would not be a gamble I would take, being that we're in Vegas. And so what we like to do is to underpromise and overdeliver. And make sure that if there is a number out there, it is a number that can actually be achieved. I just want to touch on some numbers for a bit, because I think it's important that people understand that as we're asking for additional numbers on top of that. The Upper Division States reservoirs are providing currently 661,000 acre-feet of water to Lake Powell through the Drought Response Operations Agreement. That represents 19% of our usage in 2021. 19% of our usage. Those releases have had significant impacts, huge impacts on the local communities. No compensation was given. Absolutely none. There's health and safety concerns, toxic blue algae, because the reservoirs are so low and they're warmer than historically they have been. I know that is not just a problem in the Upper Basin. I hear that that is happening, and I see that that is happening in the Lower Basin also. So we are not alone in the suffering. But I think when we talk about potentially what can we do with the demand management program, there is no silver bullet. There is no one solution. 500,000 acre-feet in Powell would not have saved us this year. 500,000 acre-feet would take not 1 year to get in Powell. It would take multiple years for us to make those kind of cuts to get that water to Powell. And so what you're asking for is a big ask, and it is a meaningful ask, and we are willing to look at this, but we also have to look at the impacts at the same time. I think it's important that we can't save the system with just that. We have to live within the means of the river. The demand management pool represents 1 month of usage in the Lower Basin. Sometimes it's greater than that demand management pool. So I urge us to think about the impacts that would have. That being said, yesterday, the UCRC, our friends up here, approved the interstate report on demand management. Up to that point, we'd been looking at it on an individual state basis and really looking at the impacts on an individual state basis. Yesterday, we all agreed of the findings of the report. We have to take those back. I would expect that everyone in these states knows that we are being watched and expected to have some results and findings from our own individual states after that interstate report came out. We have moved consistently, quickly on everything that we have committed, and I would think that the results from the demand management study will be taken back to our states, and the same thing will occur that way. And I think that covers it for me, unless my friends would like to answer.
Estevan, you have anything to add to Becky's spirited answer?
I'm not going to try and top her spiritedness. I think, first of all, I think her response about the timing of things is correct. I mean, yesterday we approved our the findings of the study that we've done on interstate aspects of the demand management. We also committed that by next June we would be bringing forward some discussions about actual feasibility of it. But I want to go a step further. In New Mexico, I think we've got, and I mentioned this yesterday at our Upper Colorado River Compact Commission meeting, we've recently, in this last summer, the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission entered into a lease with the Jicarilla Apache Nation in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, under which we're leasing, and it's not a big number, it's 20,000 acre-feet per year. Back in 2003, New Mexico enacted a statute that set up the Strategic Water Reserve. It allowed New Mexico to acquire water and water rights and storage space for two primary purposes. One is for Endangered Species Act compliance, and the other is for compact compliance. The immediate plan for putting that water to use this next year is for endangered fish compliance, releasing the water out of Navajo Reservoir. But we think that we can also get an additional bang for the buck, in that we're kind of uniquely situated in terms of being able to make that water get to Lake Powell. We want to make this a demonstration project of a demand management program, a pilot project, if you will. And Becky is right, though. I mean, the size of a demand management pool that we, a 500,000 acre-foot pool, it's not gonna save the system, but it's an important tool. We're working on it, and at least if we want to, as I said, do a demonstration project this spring.
Gene?
Jeff, I don't know if you're going to ask about the System Conservation Pilot Program, but I would just want people to know, and I agree with Becky, committing to something you don't know you have is a very challenging thing. And that's a major concern as we try to make commitments that we can live with. But I would just mention that the System Conservation Pilot Program is called a pilot program for a reason. We believe that we will learn a lot from that. We believe that that can easily be transitioned into demand management as we learn about that. And so the fact that demand management isn't coming as fast, there are steps being taken to move toward that, one of which is a System Conservation Pilot Program, which can and likely will begin with applications immediately.
Brandon?
We share in the Upper Basin.
Thank you, Gene. Yeah, so we're continuing our ongoing efforts on demand management. Just to kind of reiterate what Gene said, we understood that it was still going to take some time to determine the feasibility of demand management, and that's why we suggested system conservation as something that we felt like we could stand up immediately, and we're working on that. And then with the hopes that if we determine feasibility of demand management, that it'll just roll right in. In Wyoming, part of the progress is that we're having to deal with 2,500 diversions and 6,000 individual water rights. And we've got to get buy-in from those folks, or a demand management project or program is not going to be successful, because it's got to be voluntary. The limits of my authority and my office's authority to regulate head gates and determine an amount, I just don't have that unless something gives that to me. So that is one of the issues that we're facing, and none of us up here can make a promise that we can't keep. And so that's one of the issues that we have, is being able to promise something that we don't have the authority to enforce. And so that's one of the frustrations that I think we continue to hear, is that, and just understand that that's the reason, is not, we just legally cannot make those promises.
Switching back to the lower basin, looking at we're trying to find 2 to 4 million acre feet in fairly immediate reductions. Isn't one of the obvious starting points the roughly 1.5 million acre feet in losses in the lower basin as sort of an immediate place to start? I'm not going to call on you guys again. Why don't whoever wants to take this, and then other folks join in. What do you lower basin? What are you going to do?
I'll start. So again, California looks at the evaporation as and other system losses just as that diminution of water supply. And what I said in my first answer was that we need to balance the Glen Canyon Dam releases to the north of the border, which means that we can't continue to mine storage out of Lake Mead. And so that requires this cut in water use in the lower basin. California stepped up immediately this year with a program that will save up to 400,000 acre feet. It's a voluntary program. It's compensated. PVID and Metropolitan have committed their fallowing program at nearly 100,000 acre feet. Coachella's stopping their replenishment activities to serve their water users. IID had made a mid-year equitable distribution program, which has gone from an overrun now to an underrun, and looking at next year, working with their growers to put together a 250,000 acre foot on-farm conservation program, or fallowing combination of, which is a large hurdle. And as you said, it took 10 years to do the QSA, and we're trying to do this in 6 months. So hats off. I would say on the compensated, look, you have senior water users that feel like they have no obligation, except for that they need to save the system. So the compensation in this scenario makes sense, and so we have when we can look forward to additional leases or conservation programs that make additional cuts, that can be worked out with willing buyers and willing sellers, and that's what the program is based on. And when you look at the need for human health and safety water, there's a synergism between the junior users and the senior users, because those needs will be met. The other thing I'd like to say is in the upper basin, I hear that there's conservation going on without compensation. The same thing is happening in California. The State Water Project and the Colorado River are so combined that in the metropolitan service area that one depends on the other. And if it's a really wet Sierra Nevada, Metropolitan can save water as the ICS, put water in Lake Mead, and it works well. But we've been on a 5% allocation for the last couple years. In 2022, 750,000 acres were fallowed because of lack of water at $5 billion worth of economic impact to the state. So if those kinds of high-value diminishment in the economy are taking place, why are we limiting ourselves to $4 billion in the infrastructure, in the Inflation Reduction Act, that there could be additional dollars put forth by a number of different ways to fund that conservation, to make that water available? This is a upper and lower basin disaster that we're about to see with the hydrology. In 2023, Lake Mead could be at 1025, and if that doesn't, put our panties in a bunch, then I don't know what will. And so we've got to reduce water in the lower basin, and there are ways to do it. We have tried and true ways that we've done it. We just need to move more of those programs forward in a rapid manner.
So the short answer to your question, Jeff, is yes. I think we need to somehow account for those evap and system losses in a direct way and take it out of what we view as the available water supply. Having said that, and going back to Jeff's earlier comment about the QSA imploding, I do not necessarily have the support of my water users, senior maybe water users in Arizona for that outcome. I do not necessarily know that I could go to the legislature if I have to go, as I did for the drought contingency plan, and get approval for some agreement to do that. But for me, it's John's laws of man. This is a law of physics. So, and these aren't real numbers, but if you're diverting 1,000 acre feet, the system, and putting it to consumptive use, the system has to generate 1,500 acre feet. So we're draining the system, and every single water user who is putting water to use has to own a piece of that because it attends to every single water user's water use. I do want to say that, again, Arizona 2022, 512,000 acre feet of mandatory reductions, again with no compensation. On top of that, 325,000 acre feet of compensated conservation through the 500 plus plan that you all heard about last year at this conference. And I don't think this has gotten out into the public domain enough, but California was able recently to make their contributions to the 500 plus plan. We're going to have in 2022 somewhere around 560,000 acre feet of 500 plus plan water. So we have actually met our goal under that plan for 2022. Some of that was done in 2021, but on top of how hard it was to do that for all of us, California, Arizona, et cetera, Nevada, I don't want to leave them out, we need 4 times more than that 500,000 acre feet. And at the minimum level, as John described, and maybe that minimal level is not enough. And so while 1025 is a scary number, I'd be maybe at this point happy if we can keep the lake at 1025 after seeing Jim Prairie's presentation more than once about where low hydrology is going to send Lake Mead and Lake Powell. So 1025 is huge pain, more pain for Arizona and others. But we're not talking about on a pathway to keep the lake above 1025. That pathway is not before us right now. We're more on the pathway of Jim Prairie's 900-something numbers and other numbers that he shared at Lake Powell. So I think setting aside what the law says, the evaporation system losses to me is a very equitable outcome given the laws of physics.
I guess I want to start first by echoing Peter's sentiments about the need for national investment. I testified in front of the U.S. Senate in June, and Senator Manchin asked each of the panelists, if we were emperor for a day, what's the one thing we would do? And I didn't ask for a single thing for Nevada. I said if I were emperor for a day, I would get massive federal investment for agricultural efficiencies so that we can continue to grow the crops we need, continue to invest in food security, and at the same time use substantially less water in the process. And that's what needs to happen. If you look at the federal investment in Florida after one hurricane, they get an order of magnitude more federal insurance than the entire Colorado River Basin is getting in the face of this crisis. So we need to reboot the way we're thinking about this and really start thinking about this as a national emergency and something that needs to be invested in to not only make the agricultural communities more efficient, the urban communities more efficient, but also set up ways to transition and buffer the effects to those rural economies in particular as this crisis continues to unfold. So that's my first answer, because I don't want to come across as, you know, we're all M&I here in Nevada and we're being anti-ag. We're not anti-ag. We need to find a way to continue to run all of our economies with less water. But to Jeff's question, you know, probably most of the people in the room have seen Nevada's analysis of the evaporation and system losses. The law is complicated, the politics are complicated, the science and the math are not complicated. Below Lee's Ferry, down to the northern international border, we lose 1.5 million acre feet a year moving water and evaporating off of reservoirs. As Jeff said in his opening, we spent the last 20 years negotiating 1.3 million acre feet in reductions, and that includes the, you know, until now, seemingly mysterious 100,000 acre feet of federal contributions that have yet to manifest themselves. So we're 200,000 to 300,000 acre feet short of accounting for evaporation and system losses. So as Peter framed it, we're mining storage. We haven't even accounted for the amount of water we're losing out of the system. So until we do that, and you guys know Nevada, we're pretty, you know, non-dogmatic. We don't care what you call it. Call it evaporation, call it system losses, call it, you know, strawberry shortcake. We don't care, but do the math and face reality.
Turning back to the Upper Basin, I've heard a lot of folks in the Upper Basin over the years kind of talk about this is what we have here is a Lower Basin problem. They've been overusing, they've maxed out their usage for decades. They've draining the system with their not dealing with their losses. And we don't really see this as an Upper Basin need to contribute. I've also heard maybe we're going to add new pipelines and we've got new growth, and we don't really have to do anything until we've at least gotten to 7.5. So meanwhile, we have a system that's pretty maxed out, obviously, overly maxed out, and we can't really accommodate more growth. So without picking on any one state, how about Utah start this discussion?
Jeff, I once heard you say, when asked, how do you handle growth, I quote you, that's above my pay grade.
Years ago, yeah.
That was years ago? Okay.
I'm a new man.
Well, let me just say this. I've been coming to this conference for longer than I want to admit, and I've been sitting out there for many years, which is a whole lot more comfortable, by the way, than sitting up here in these bright lights. But every time there was a challenge on the river, Someone stood at that very podium and said, if you get your stuff together, states, we'll be happy. If you don't, and I'm going to refer to some of your cartoon characters, Jeff, that you mentioned earlier today, of folks that stood at that very podium and said, this will happen. Well, today, it's not the federal government standing there saying, if you don't do this. It's the hydrology saying, if you don't do this, the reservoirs are empty. That's the reality we're facing, an entirely different scenario than what we've faced in the past. There is no doubt the hydrology is our challenge. There are extremely limited avenues to deal with water when it's just not there. 20 years ago, 2 decades ago, water planning in this basin was different. The reservoirs were full. There was optimism that things would continue to be that way. And so there were things that were thought of or conceived that, based on the hydrology today, tell us it's not going to happen. And the focus, particularly in southern Utah, has been a monumental shift from building to let's manage every drop of water we can get our hands on. So things such as reuse, recycling are happening in southern Utah. Reuse, recycling in the Wasatch Front creates a different challenge because that water is currently going to the Great Salt Lake. And by the way, if you haven't heard, the Great Salt Lake's a little lower than it has ever been in the past. So that creates some challenges in and of itself. Some of the most aggressive water ordinances have been implemented. I would also mention that the rate structure has been modified so that there's an extremely high surcharge for overuse, for high use. Ag efficiencies is a major part of how we anticipate moving forward with this limited water supply that we have. We were part of the municipal MOU to identify best practices that many up here have signed on to. Districts, communities, municipalities that represent about 85% of the state of Utah have signed on to that MOU. We're looking at desalinization of springs, moving forward with things that two decades ago we didn't need to look at, but now we do, and they're happening. And so I would just tell you that the mindset is different because the hydrology is different. The risk is different than it was. And we're doing everything we can to focus on what water we have. The legislature last year committed $500 million for conservation, more money in 1 year than all prior years in the state of Utah committed to conservation. Governor Cox has $561 million in his governor's budget proposal for next year, and we don't see a lot of opposition in the legislature for additional significant money for water conservation activities. And so the things that are happening, particularly in Utah, and many of these things are happening in all of the states, but the things that are happening in Utah is an extremely increased effort on conservation. We have a statewide turf removal program. We're doing anything and everything that's been done and is being done in the other states is happening in Utah right now. We may not be at the scale simply because of budgets or quantities of some of the others, but we're in the middle of everything and anything that we can do to make sure that we do our fair share to use our waters wisely and as efficiently as possible. So I'll leave it with that, Jeff.
Thanks, Gene. I don't appreciate being quoted that way, but that's good. I don't know, does anyone else from the Upper Basin got any comments on that? Or Gene, did Gene cover it? Okay. Lower Basin comments?
I just want to say, in some ways, I think Utah gets a bad rap because of the Lake Powell pipeline. That's kind of the poster child for, are we going to be able to continue urban growth in the basin? But Las Vegas is still issuing building permits. Phoenix just got upped from the Taiwanese semiconductor investment from 12 billion to 40 billion. I was in Denver last week and counted 15 cranes downtown. So these cities are growing, and it's not just Utah, but the reality that all of the municipalities need to face is if you're going to continue to add people, if you're going to continue to diversify your economies and add new hookups, you need to do so in a way that is not just a zero water footprint, but a way that you're continuing to do that and reduce your overall net use. And I don't mean reducing your GPCD, I mean reducing your net use. And it is possible. The technologies are there, you need the financial investment, and you need the political will. And that's the obligation of the cities, that we need to do all of that to keep our economies going and have a negative water footprint if we're going to turn and look at the agricultural sector and say, you got to do your part too.
I'd like to switch gears a little bit from upper lower basin to something that's, I think, a system issue. And I started out with some of the unresolved or partially resolved issues, among them Mexico, the environment, and tribes. Two states, I think, have really made a lot of progress in recent years working with the tribes, and probably Arizona and New Mexico really come to mind. How do you feel, how do we manage these significant reductions and dealing with the growing needs of the tribes in this scenario? And I'd like to hear from Tom and Estevan on that.
So this situation on the river has obviously exacerbated that problem for us. I have 22 federally recognized tribes in Arizona, 11 of which in whole or in part, and mostly in whole, have not had their water rights quantified. The way Arizona has settled several tribal water right issues is using lower priority Colorado River water. That water has been taken away from those tribes who've settled, partially and next year wholly. And I'm not going to be in a room negotiating with a tribe for a settlement and offering them this low priority water, because I don't know that it's ever going to be there again. And so we have a huge challenge in terms of how we're going to deal with that issue. And we're on a path to having non-tribal water users who've been using water for decades, probably having their water taken from them as these tribal water right claims are either settled or litigated in a courtroom. So we did have some success in tribal entities coming to the fore to help us deliver the drought contingency plan through my legislature. I have a bunch of tribes, I won't try to name them all, that have contributed over the years to conservation in Lake Mead through the compensated programs that have existed, probably starting in about 2014. A lot of the 325,000 acre feet of calendar year 2022 500 plus water is coming from tribes in Arizona. So they have been increasingly important partners with us. There are still many tribes who want to be more proactive in the room with us. I think all 22 tribes would like to be sitting with us at this table right now, if they could. So we have an obligation to grow our relationship with those tribes and to bring them into the fold among the states as we deal with how we're going to stabilize the system. But huge challenges, and in Arizona we can't rely on low priority Colorado River water anymore to come to grips with our tribal needs.
In New Mexico, I think we've been really fortunate to have resolved two of the three tribal water rights claims in the San Juan Basin. We've resolved the Jicarilla Apache water rights back in 1992, and in 2009 we resolved the claims of the Navajo Nation. And I think certainly I foolishly thought we were done there in terms of the tribal water rights in the basin. And But, I wasn't taking into account the fact that Mountain Ute has a portion of their reservation that extends down into New Mexico. And I simply assumed that there wasn't a claim there because there's not any population base there. But they've asserted a claim, and we're working with them to try and resolve that. But it's going to be a real challenge. Let me give you some numbers just to put this in context. If New Mexico if we actually had what was contemplated in back when the compacts were negotiated, and we have 11.25% of the Upper Basin's supply. If that was 7.5 million, New Mexico would have a right to it's just under 840,000 acre feet. We're nowhere close to that. Today, we're using something on the order of about 410,000 acre feet. But when we settled the Navajo claims, we had to try and analyze how much we thought was actually available. And we thought that that the basin would yield such that New Mexico should have 640,000. These are round numbers. And pretty much the entire amount was allocated to deal with that claim. Today, we're dealing with the reality that we're at 410,000 or so, and we're going down. Thankfully, the Jicarilla Apache Nation has pretty much developed their water, and they've been using it, and that affords us the opportunity to enter into lease with them for some of that. The Navajos, they have not fully developed their supply. I think they're probably on the order of about 65% of what they were granted in that settlement, and we've got to find a way of dealing with Ute Mountain Ute. So this is going to be a really big challenge all the way around. But I've got to give credit where credit is due. The tribal nations, while they've not been they've not been represented in so many of these discussions, they continue to step up to help us find solutions over and over and over again. And so I got to agree with Tom. We've got to find a way of giving them meaningful engagement. And in that light, I just want to point out the fact that in the Upper Basin, the Upper Basin, Upper Division states and the Upper Division tribes, we've been meeting over the last year. We've had a series of meetings that have been really excellent in terms of the quality of the dialogue that's going back and forth between us. So they're very frank discussions. We are pushing the envelope on trying to find ways of being more inclusive of those, and we need to continue to do that.
And just to reiterate your point, Estevan, I think we've had two remarkably good partners over the last couple of decades in the tribes and in Mexico. Mexico agreeing to take a share of cuts through the drought contingency plan and the 2007 guidelines, even when not immediately represented at the table. And obviously those conversations are going to continue with this next set of reductions. And so they've always stepped up to the plate thus far. A couple of things I wanted to kind of wrap up with. One was someone talked about system conservation as a pilot program. We've been doing it for a couple decades now. It's been pretty successful. In the beginning, Pat Terrell, I remember, had a lot of concern with the Upper Basin about system conservation programs and the impact it might have in the Upper Basin. Have those concerns kind of eased? Is it something we could see scaled up on an order of magnitude if you had a few $1 billion from the federal government, and maybe hear from Wyoming to begin that?
Yeah, and you're correct. There were concerns with the original program. Folks were worried about the potential of abandonment of their water rights under our state law. They were concerned about injuring neighboring rights, the negative impacts to a rural community, drying up an entire community, And also, the perception that they're just sending water downstream to swap a Wyoming use for a lower basin use were some of the concerns. But that original program had a different primary goal. At that time, I think the primary goal was to investigate if there was an appetite to do a voluntary conservation program. I think more recently, those concerns and sensitivities still exist, but I do believe, and in our conversations with our governor's working group and our stakeholders, I think that the folks are sensing their growing concern and a sense of responsibility to help solve the issues we're facing now. So I think the people that were adamantly opposed originally are maybe still opposed, but they recognize that it's a tool. And I don't feel that many will stand in the way of using this tool to help us create solutions. But I also get the sense that there's more of an appetite for a program such as a possible demand management program. But I really think what our folks are after is the longer term efficiency improvements and longer term conservation efforts. So I know Gene mentioned that there was a shift in mentality, and I sense that in Wyoming as well, particularly with the concept of system conservation.
Anyone else? Yeah, Estevan.
I think you asked, could it be scaled up an order of magnitude? Frankly, I'm not sure that it can. And it's, if you listen to Chuck's presentation earlier, he talked about the distributed nature of our water rights, how, you know, it's thousands of points of diversions. It's while there's interest and a willingness to participate, it is much more difficult in the upper basin to get large conservation amounts given the reality of the way our system works. I think there's a willingness. I think we're gonna work with our water users to do more than we've done before, but even, you know, we didn't conserve that much when we did it prior. We can do more, but it's going to be hard to get really big numbers. We shouldn't expect really big numbers out of it.
Yeah. Yep. Well, that's what I've heard from others. We have 10 minutes left, so I thought I'd give everyone a chance to take a couple minutes and wrap up and give some concluding thoughts and give a little bit of their state perspective. And we'll start, just work our way down. Nevada, John.
I guess this is, my first CRWUA was 1999, and I've been here every year except for 2020 when none of us were here. So my career has been witnessing the fits and starts and backsliding and occasional monumental successes of this basin. But as Jeff started off with, every good thing we've done has taken years. You know, he said, I didn't even know the QSA. There was a draft in 1998. I was still in law school. It took us 5 years to negotiate a 5-year DCP. We don't have 5 months to come up with an operation plan for 2023 and 2024. So it's past time. I can look at all 6 of my colleagues up here and dozens of people across this room, and I can give your well-worn talking points. It's time to set them aside and get real.
Peter?
So California has the largest ag-to-urban transfer in the basin, and we want to keep that intact. The recent action that the Bureau took with the Salton Sea Cooperative Agreement with Imperial Irrigation District, CVWD, and the California Natural Resources Agency was monumental in allowing for the conservation of the water in 2023. It's those types of quick action by the U.S. Bureau that are going to drive a lot of this. It enables the conservation to happen. We see that we have about 30 days to comment as a group here to Reclamation to come up with a consensus of a framework of ideas, or else the U.S. Bureau will have their framework to impose. And we believe that the collaboration of all the states, which means all of you and all of us here, to come up with that framework that responds in light speed action to this imminent crisis that we have. So it's incumbent upon all of us to participate in that and to just accept the math, as John would say, and it's an important aspect of what we're doing here. Thank you.
Tom?
Agree 100% with John. It's time to get real. One of the huge challenges for all of us, and certainly in my state, is right now there is so much uncertainty about our future. So we have the voluntary compensated conservation plan with the IRA money, right? At the same time, there may need to be some imposed actions by the federal government in a situation where the water is a zero-sum game, right? All of us as water managers, all of us in my state, all the people in my state that are water managers, whether it's municipal, industrial, or agriculture, are asking me for more certainty, and I can't give it to them. And again, that pendulum in my mind is still swinging towards more uncertainty, not less uncertainty. And so it is making it really difficult when my folks say, well, Tom, if the federal government or if you all come to an agreement on dealing with the losses, whether it's strawberry shortcake or whatever cake, how is that going to impact me? And I can't tell them how it will because I don't know how it might be implemented. And so it is really difficult to build a support as we sit at this table trying to negotiate outcomes. And I really implore all of us who have an opportunity to start reducing the uncertainty pendulum to do so. I implore the federal government to, as soon as they possibly can, let us know what the volume is that they expect to get out of the voluntary compensated conservation plan, so we all at this table know the delta between that number and the 2, 3, 4 million acre feet, whatever that is, that we're working towards. Because we're talking kind of in the abstract right now about what the target is. And it's hard enough to talk and make something happen, just makes it harder. So I guess that's my ask. We need more certainty about what is going to happen so folks can assess how they are impacted and whether or not they can live with that impact, whether that's in priority or out of priority.
Becky.
We're in an incredibly critical time right now, and listening to my partners in the lower basin and hearing that need for certainty, I think that's a need across the basin. The only way to do that is to start working together now and every day until we have this problem solved. Time is not on our side. Hydrology is not on our side. That is the real frightening thing right now. It is not federal action. It is what the hydrology is going to show us. It is going to force us to do something because we will have no other choices. Every day that passes, this problem gets harder and harder to solve. So we have to move quickly. We're committed to that. I'm committed to that, to the highest levels of administration. They have said use every day, every minute, every hour, every second to get to a solution. We don't have a choice. I think we have to recommit to working with each other. I think we have to find inclusive, durable, long-term solutions. The problem is not today. It is from here on out. And we have to accept that the situation that we are in, and we need to reduce demands. All of us, every sector, every state, every water user. We have to do that. I don't think there's any other way. There's not one solution. We have to accept that we cannot cling to our entitlements or allocations. If they are not there, none of that matters. It does not matter. And I think we can do it. I think it's going to be hard for us. Tom often says, I won't be able to go back to my state. I don't think any of us should be able to go back to our states. I think it's going to be really hard decisions, and we have to be able to do that. But we have the history of making really hard decisions, and in this time frame, in these last couple years of hard times, there are some positives. The funding that has come in provides opportunity. It provides the ability to change and some cushion. And I think that is a huge positive. The federal government putting out the notice of intent for the SEIS says we have to do something different. I think we have to use that opportunity. We have the positives that we're seeing with the tribal nations. New Mexico is a perfect example. I think we have to build on those positives and say we more like that. There are, I think, 32 proposals from the lower basins, for lower basin states for reductions. I think that's a positive. It's a start. And the 5-point plan, the movements even made yesterday, we have to build on that. It's the only way we're going to get through this. The option of leaving one behind is not an option. And I think these people up here are capable of it. It is hard, but it also means that the folks in the room have to be willing to let them make hard decisions that we're not going to like. In our breakfast in the Colorado breakfast this morning, I said to them, you will not like all of our decisions. You will not like all of my decisions because this is going to be painful.
Estevan? Yeah.
I should just say ditto and share in some of that applause. But I agree with all of what Becky just said, and I want to just mention, I want to also echo the sentiments that John and Peter said about the need for investment. I just want to make sure that we don't. We shouldn't assume that we can continue to just have voluntary, compensated, temporary reductions. We've got to use the monies that we have for durable solutions. That's absolutely essential if we're going to have a lasting solution. Lastly, I'm going to say, and I have no idea why this is, but in the last few days, I'm feeling optimistic about where we are. You know, for the last 6 months, since we heard from Commissioner Tootin in June about the need to move, it's been so frustrating to try and say, well, we got to get moving, and for whatever reason, we haven't been able to get there. There's a palpable change in the atmosphere that we're feeling. I think we've finally come to the conclusion that we don't have a choice. And we know what we have to work with. I think we can come together in what will, if we're successful, it will be an incredibly compressed time frame. You know, essentially a month and a half to try and come to a consensus solution. But we can get there.
Gene?
Jeff, you started off by saying this is a very complex issue. You're exactly right. I don't think there's a person in this room that doesn't understand that. Time short, so I'll be brief. I am convinced that the people that can make this happen are involved in the process. We've got some sharp federal folks, sharp folks up here. I'm convinced that it can happen. Will it be hard? Yes. Will it hurt? Yes. Will it be expensive? Yes. Will everyone like it? No. But I'm committed to making it work. I think all of us are, and I look forward to continuing to work to make this happen. As has been said, what's the option? Thank you.
And Brandon.
To steal Estevan's ample words, ditto. But no, these are real complex issues that we're dealing with. But I will say, and we talked Tuesday, I made the commitment that I am fully committed to working with the members you see up here, our federal partners, and all of our stakeholders to come to solutions that will be sustainable and long-term in dealing with the issues that we're likely facing even in the future.
Well, thank you, panel. I did not leave time for questions from the audience. I apologize for that, but Becky has volunteered to stay up here for another hour or so. So let's thank the panel. Great job.